Good morning. I'm John Danner. Thanks for joining me for this morning. We're going to be talking about a new book that I and my colleague Chris Keeney have written called Built for Growth. But I guess before I introduce the book, I probably ought to introduce myself. I teach here at Haas at the Business School and a couple of other programs at UC Berkeley. But I also have the privilege of teaching at one of the finest private universities in the world as well, Princeton. Every fall. So I get both the best of public and the best of private universities in the United States and potentially the world. I've had a chance over the course of my career not only to teach, but also to start businesses, to help other companies launch businesses, and have been fascinated by the process of why is it that so many startups and so many new ventures inside established companies tend not to defy the odds. They don't survive, they don't grow. And as you undoubtedly know, regardless of your title or your organization or the industry in which you operate, growth really is the core agenda for almost every company, every business. Now, lots and lots of great books and resources have been written about the whys, the whats, and the hows of growth. But really, nobody has quite focused in on what my co-author Chris and I have identified as really the central mystery, and that's the who. And let me see if I can just put this in a picture form for you. If those of you who have been involved in trying to grow a new business, whether as a standalone startup or as a new venture inside an established company, know there are a number of challenges. This is a very complicated process. It is an equation with many, many variables. But when you look at the growth phenomenon and you begin to see, well, what are those challenges? Chris and I see them as basically 5. Let me see if I can just sketch them out. So, first of all, it might help if I had a marker that I open, huh? So, think about the 5 platforms here, if I can do this correctly. There we go. So every company needs to start with a set of ideas. And the first challenge is, how do you convert that idea into a product or into a solution that the market will buy? Let's just call that the dynamic challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 has to do with the team that you have. And the issue with the team is, how do you convert employees to disciples of your business? People that really believe in what you're doing, so that they can communicate with the kind of passion and intensity that it sometimes takes to overcome the inevitable difficulties and obstacles between launching a business and creating a venture of enduring scale and scope. Third, you need customers, obviously. And customers are not just people that buy. The real issue is, can you transform a buyer into a partner? Somebody who sees a vested interest, a mutual interest in your success as you do in their success. How do you bring money into the transaction? How do you bring sponsors, backers, investors, executive sponsors? And how do you align them to your business as it unfolds? And finally, the challenge of scale. How do you elevate your business? Or how, as Chris and I talk about in the book, how do you move from self to system, so that you can take full advantage of the potential of that idea that you started with? Now, there's nothing really new about those 5 dynamic challenges. You need to basically recognize that they're going to recur and they interact with one another over the course of the development of a new venture. But those are the whats and the settings in which you launch and grow a new business. What's missing? What's missing is the central question, and that is who? Who are the women and men at the center of this entrepreneurial growth process? What makes them tick? How do they make decisions? How do they lead? How do they manage? Why are they doing what they're doing? Because, to put it very simply, who you are shapes how you grow. There have been many, many efforts to try to unravel this puzzle, if you will. Our book focuses on the centerpiece, the who. Now, I talked about personality. The subtitle of the book is actually How Builder Personality Shapes Your Company, Your Team, and Your Ability to Win. But what is it that comprises personality? We all have different personalities. But what are the elements that make up a personality in a particular context? And we see them as 4 factors. The first is, what is your motivation to be an entrepreneur to begin with? Why are you doing this? Some people are born to be an entrepreneur, and other people are basically drawn to entrepreneurship more or less by accident or happenstance. Second, how do you prefer to make decisions? Are you someone who tends to make decisions based on facts and figures and analysis? Or do you tend to make decisions more on the basis of your gut instinct, almost your intuition? Third, how is it that you manage the people around you? Have people characterized you as somewhat of a control freak? Or do you tend to have more of a laissez-faire approach to managing people? And finally, what is your leadership style? Do you see other people in the organization as complements to you, or as people that you are basically trying to lead and they are followers? Now, I've talked about this at a fairly conceptual level. I've talked about the dynamic challenges of growth. We've talked about the centerpiece of the entrepreneurial growth puzzle, which is the who. And I've given you some idea about the 4 factors that comprise personality. But let me try to make this personal if we can. If you go to our website, www.builtforgrowth.com, right now, in about 2 minutes, you can take our Builder Personality Discovery Quiz and find out which of these types that we're going to be talking about you are most like. Are you a driver? Are you an explorer? Are you a crusader? Or are you a captain? And I'll be explaining and giving you examples of the differences among those 4 types. Because, you know, whether I'm teaching here, I'm teaching in the East Coast, or I'm working with executives or companies, a lot of times people think that in order to be a successful grower of business, a builder of businesses, you need to be a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk. And that's not surprising, because those are the folks and those are the kinds of personalities that tend to get a lot of media attention. Our research has discovered that's just one of 4 types of highly successful builders of business. And we'll talk about all 4 in a second. But while some of you or most of you are taking this quiz, let me tell you a little bit about the research that has gone into this book. We call it personality clustering. It's a patented proprietary research methodology that Chris Keeney developed at his prior firm, Rosetta, which became one of the largest digital marketing companies in the world before he sold it a few years ago to the Publicis Group. Personality clustering is really an amazing technology. It has been used in hundreds of markets around the world in many, many product and service categories to try to decode how you and I buy things in a market. And when Chris and I sat down a couple of years ago and were comparing notes on our respective interests, we realized that there was an opportunity to take the power of this methodology and move it upstream to try to decode the personalities of the people who create the businesses that bring those products and services to market. So that's the technology and methodology that we have used. We started off with a questionnaire with over 100 questions in it. We've interviewed more than 1,000+ successful entrepreneurs in various industries around the country and indeed around the world. The beauty of the algorithm in this methodology is that it allows us to go from those 100 questions and all the permutations and combinations of possible answers to identify 4 types. Those types are homogeneous within themselves, but heterogeneous to the other 3. In other words, when we say you might be a driver, we know how to cluster the drivers, but drivers are very different from the other 3. Now, hopefully that's given you some time while I've gone off into research land. It's given you some time to take the test if you're interested in it and get a sense of which of these types you might most resemble from the point of view of your builder personality. But now let me get into these 4 types. We start with the driver. What is it about a driver? You can think about drivers as fundamentally being fixated by product, by the product market fit. These are people that believe so much in the solution that they're bringing to the marketplace that they almost fall prey to what Chris and I call product narcissism. So let's start with a driver. Drivers are fixated by product. Who are some examples? Well, I mentioned Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. Those are two very famous examples. But let me give you an idea about somebody who may not be as well known. A guy named Steve Brightman, who's the builder of a business called Sebco Laundry Solutions. Now, this is a guy who is every bit as driven. He's made up the same way as some of the more famous drivers that you may be familiar with. But his business isn't high tech. His business is commercial laundries in apartment buildings, mostly in the New York area. And starting out with the idea that people needed a different way of basically doing their laundry on a weekly basis, he's now built a business that has over 40,000 laundry operations in apartment buildings all over the metropolitan area. So Steve is a driver, just like Steve Jobs is a driver. And there are examples on both the famous and the less so famous category in each one of these particular builder types. We've mentioned a number of other people. Ben Weiss, any of you have had a chance to taste a drink called Bai, B-A-I 5. It's a very popular new beverage on the market. Ben Weiss is a driver, the founder of Bai. He just sold his business to the Dr. Pepper Snapple distribution organization for over $1 billion. He believes intensely in his product. Let me give you an example of what that means. If you visit the Bai headquarters in New Jersey, you will notice that people are wearing a dog tag around their neck. And that's kind of an interesting artifact, but when you look more closely and ask people, what's on that dog tag? What's on most people's dog tag is a number, and the number's a little different for you or me or the person sitting next to us. That number is the number of cases of Bai 5 beverages that you have personally signed on to help sell this year. Now that's product identification. That's an organization that is so focused, so fixated on the product they're bringing to the market. What Ben says in terms of how he built the business, how he got his original investors, a great story. He would go into a group of venture capitalists and he would put a can of his drink out for each person in the audience and invite them to just sample it. And he'd sit back and then reel off statistics about this particular category of the marketplace, which he has created basically around this beverage drink. And that was his sales pitch. So drivers fixated by product. That's the gift that they bring, a kind of almost intuitive understanding of where a market is evolving. But with those gifts come some gaps. Drivers can be tough to work with, tough to work for. They tend to want people who are as driven as they are. And as in a car situation, it's very tough to have multiple hands on the steering wheel. So drivers can have difficulty in basically empowering a diverse set of other motivations and other skill sets and other ideas because of the single-mindedness with which they focus on the product and solution that they're bringing to the marketplace. Now let's go to the next category, an explorer. If drivers are fixated by product, explorers you might think of as fascinated by the puzzle. These are people that are really drawn to the complexity of a particular problem. They tend to be very systems thinking in their orientation. They're fascinated by trying to understand how something that nobody else has quite been able to figure out actually can be figured out. How can it be worked? They almost become entrepreneurs by accident. In other words, having arrived at the solution of this complicated puzzle, the picture on the box top, if you will, they realize that commercializing their solution may be the best way to capture value from what it is they've done. And not surprisingly, they tend to attract other puzzle solvers, other systems thinkers, to their efforts. Who would be an example of an explorer? I think you could use Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, as a great example of somebody drawn to the puzzle, if you will, drawn to the problem. But a perhaps less well-known example of an explorer would be somebody like Brian O'Kelly, who's the founder of a business called AppNexus. AppNexus is one of the giants behind the scene of the web. They've created a solution to the advertising auction business that fits ads on a real-time basis into what we all see when we're on various sites on the web. Brian loves puzzle solving. He's a problem solver. And the people around him in his core group also share that same focus. Now, I mentioned gifts and gaps. What might be the gaps of an explorer? Well, think about two just as examples. One is, if you're drawn into a puzzle by your curiosity, sometimes having solved it, your curiosity wants to take you to the next puzzle before you might have had an opportunity to fully benefit from what you'd solved in the previous effort. Secondly, explorers sometimes have difficulty in getting to the personal level, the personal dimension of the people that they need around them in order to be able to scale the businesses based on the solutions they arrived at originally. They tend to see people sometimes as inputs to an analytical process rather than fully dimensioned human beings who need to be motivated and inspired perhaps in different ways than the intellectual satisfaction of having solved that particular complex puzzle. So again, famous examples, less so famous examples, but those two types share similar characteristics around their motivation, around how they make decisions. By the way, not surprisingly, explorers are fact-based decision makers. How they manage people and how they ultimately lead. So we've talked about two of these four types. What about the other two? Well, let me go to number three. Number three we call the Crusader. How is a Crusader anchored? Mostly, Crusaders are inspired by the mission. These are entrepreneurs that see a long-term vision. They're pursuing not the next quarter's results. They're trying to go for a longer range goal out there, whether it is to change society and use a business to do that, or trying to transform a market landscape. These folks think in long-term visionary terms. And because of that, they oftentimes can inspire investors, customers, and employees who are similarly inspired by the grandeur or the idealism or simply the mere challenge of the vision that they come to personify. I'll give you two famous examples whose products you've probably tasted yourself, and that's Ben & Jerry. We had an opportunity to interview both Ben and Jerry for the book. And when they talk about their vision for the business, when they talk about why they did what they did, what motivates them, how they wanted to manage, how they made decisions, how they wanted to lead, these people are different than the kinds of drivers and explorers that I talked about earlier. But they're not alone in this regard. You could think about the founders of Google, we think, as crusaders. Read some of the early descriptions of Google. What motivated Sergey Brin and Larry Page? Long-term, big-scale vision for what Google was originally intended to do and has largely done in many ways. Or think about somebody like Jessica Alba, the founder of the Honest Company, and how she describes her almost accidental motivation to become an entrepreneur in order to bring healthy products to young mothers and their children across the United States. Famous, less famous, but very similarly wired. So that leaves me with the fourth category. And the fourth category, the type we call the captain. Now, drivers motivated, fixated by products, explorers fascinated by puzzles, crusaders inspired by mission. What does that mean the captains are organized around? These folks tend to be intrigued by the potential of the teams that they assemble as part of their businesses. A good example of this would be a woman named Marjorie Krauss, who's the founder of the #2 independent PR organization in the world called APCO Worldwide. When Marjorie talks about her style as a builder of businesses, she doesn't talk about me. She talks about we. She talks about the team, about pulling together people and giving them a culture and an environment in which their individual backgrounds, their own styles, their own disciplinary instincts can come to the fore as part of a more collaborative effort. And when you think about where we started this exploration of builder personalities, you can begin to see how very different captains tend to be from, for example, drivers. Drivers manage around me, around my idea for this product. Captains, although similarly decisive when need be, would prefer to have other people's fingerprints on the strategy and approach to growth that their particular companies manifest. Now, I'll give you a couple other examples of captains. There's a person named Suri Yakumar who is in a business that basically started off as a blueprint business, rolling up blueprints. And Suri recognized that there was an opportunity to basically expand his team by changing the business model around which those kinds of services could go from paper-based to digital. And Suri manages his everyday activities around the ability and shared vision of his team. Now, if you've had a chance, I'd be curious if you could send in your note about whether you've taken the test yet, you've taken the quiz, and if so, what kind of driver, what kind of explorer, what kind of crusader, or what kind of captain you might be. By all means, fire your questions. I'm happy to try to answer them as best we can in this particular kind of format. Why is this so important? Because these are the people around whom the key decisions of how businesses grow are made. These are the people who make the hard choices. These are the people who decide what kind of team they need to assemble, how they need to go to market, what kind of investors they need to align with, whether they need a co-founder or not, and what kind of co-founder might bring out the best of their particular strengths and offset, perhaps, some of their weaknesses. Now, you are who you are to some extent, but your builder personality is not a straitjacket. You have the opportunity to apply the insight and self-knowledge that comes from this particular way of looking at yourself as a potential builder of businesses and do something with it. There's a very famous definition of entrepreneurship by Professor Howard Stevenson at the Harvard Business School. And he described entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you control. Now just ask yourself, beyond the resources you control, you don't control the money you need, you don't control necessarily the customers whose decisions and support you need, you don't even control the employees that you need to bring a business to fruition. There is one resource that is quintessentially within your control, and that's you. That's your personality. That's what you start with. That's what you're going to be left with. So the question you might want to pose for yourself is, what can I do with this insight? How can I begin to apply it in a way that improves my odds and my business's odds of successful growth? Because as I started off saying, growth is job one here. Growth is the prerequisite for survival and for scale. Chris and I, at the end of our book, suggest there are two fundamental strategies available to you. One is what we call the expert builder strategy. And you might think about this as basically playing to your strengths. You go deep where you're already strong. Let me use a tennis example. If you were a great forehand tennis player, you would want to be the best forehand tennis player in the world if you could be. I'll give you a quote from Paul Mader, who's the former chairman of the National Venture Capital Association. Paul is also somebody that we interviewed for the book. And he said, look, I invest in people and careers. I don't care which of these types you are, just be the best darned version of that you can be. Be the best driver you can be or the best crusader you can be, because no one type has a monopoly on the success that all entrepreneurs are looking for. So an expert strategy for becoming a stronger builder is about elevating your strengths and delegating around the weaknesses that we all have. And each of those categories, each of those types, have a different set of weaknesses. But there's another strategy as well to become a stronger builder. And that's what we call the master builder. So if the expert builder is a vertical focus, the master builder begins to talk horizontally and begins to think about how I can borrow techniques and strengths from another type, another builder personality type, and through practice begin to make them my own. You don't become a different person. You just become a person, a builder with a broader portfolio. In tennis, not only am I a great forehand person, but I work on my backhand. I practice it. And I become a pretty good, maybe not as good a backhand player as I am forehand, but I've rounded out my repertoire. I've expanded my repertoire. Now, let me just, if I can, respond to some questions here. If I can, I'm going to move to the screen for a second, so I apologize for getting off camera here for a second. So, fascinated by this, definitely see this helping me better understand myself as a leader of teams I work with. Excited to join the Letters and Sciences. As a freshman, can you recommend any courses for an aspiring entrepreneur? The good news about courses around entrepreneurship at Berkeley is you're going to have a cornucopia to choose from. All you've got to do is check with the Lester Center here at Haas, or go online and in the catalog and just type in entrepreneurship, and you'll have opportunities to explore high-tech entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, what it means to launch a new business. You're in for a great experience. And if you have any questions about it after you've done that search, just let me know on my email, and I'll be happy to give you some more advice. One of you said, I got Crusader because he didn't think that the type quite fit how he was responding to the questions. Here's a way to think about that. This methodology is based on self-reporting. So it's as good as the honesty and candor with which you answer those questions. You might, as you've done, take the quiz again, and maybe even ask some of your colleagues to see whether or not the results that you get from the quiz match against their own perception of you as a potential builder of businesses. It's not surprising that people aren't necessarily purely one type or the other. Some of us are composites, some of us are strong in one area and less strong in another. But I encourage you to do what thousands of others are doing now on this quiz. Use it as a tool for your own self-discovery. Use it as a tool to think about why it is that this particular type came out of that algorithm. What is it about how I answer the questions, about how I think about some of these issues related to the 4 questions of motivation, decision-making, leadership, management style? It's another question, why is this so important? Well, lots of people have written great work around what it takes to build a successful business. Many of you may be familiar with the lean startup approach and focuses very much, importantly enough, on product market fit. What I would suggest to you, and I'll leave you with this idea, is that as important as product market fit is, the issue of your fit with the team you have, the customers you develop, the investors that you recruit, that dimension of fit between builder personality and these other growth dynamics can be the real difference maker in whether your business is going to be successful over the long term and successful as a scaled enterprise. Product market fit, critical. Builder personality fit, comparable and complementary. I'll boil it all down in one phrase. Who you are shapes how you build. Oh, got some more questions. Can a person slide between different entrepreneurial personalities during a lifetime, or is the entrepreneurial personality fairly static? Well, I hope I dealt with that a little bit in terms of these 2 strategies that you have available, whether it's an expert strategy or a master builder strategy. You're always going to have preferences. You're always going to have strengths that you would prefer to rely upon. And comparably, you're going to have some weaknesses or gaps that you may want to address. So it's not rigid. You do have an ability to shape it. At the very least, you have ability to understand it, to be more conscious of your own personality type as a builder, and to use that to the best advantage possible in navigating the challenges associated with building a successful business. So don't view it as a lock that's on, you're always in one category or another. You can expand your repertoire, and you can be successful staying more or less in the type that you are, because no one of these builder personality types has a monopoly on long-term entrepreneurial success. Gallup's Strength Finder system says that skills experiences can compensate areas where natural strength is weak. Is it the same with this? Gallup's Strength Finders is a wonderful methodology. It answers a slightly different question than what Chris and I have focused on in this book. What Gallup Strength Finders is wonderful at is helping you understand whether or not you might want to, if I used an analogy of the marathon, whether you might want to enter the marathon of entrepreneurship. We're answering a different question. We're focusing on people that have won the marathon and trying to understand what it is about how they're wired as builder personalities. Because in the grand scheme of things, we'd like to be able to offer our readers an opportunity to learn from the winners of that marathon rather than simply the runners. Now, what's the comparison? Our methodology goes all the way back to things that you may be familiar with in your own organizations. The Myers-Briggs typology, Hogan assessment, the five-factor approach, DISC analyses, and obviously strength finders as well. They are all part of the cluster of personality research methodologies. Each of them looks at a slightly different context, if you will. Our context is entrepreneurial success. You have the same kind of an opportunity in any of those other techniques to understand a different dimension of yourself, but it's in a slightly different context. And you have to ask yourself which context is most relevant to what I deal with. Myers-Briggs is wonderful potentially, as are Hogan and other tools, to help you understand yourself as a personality in a number of different settings. Strength Finders is terrific to help you understand whether or not you might want to migrate into entrepreneurship. And our approach basically helps you learn from the people who have won that marathon of entrepreneurship. Running a company now, growth is, as you said, everything. But as we grow and my leadership is tested, I'm finding it hard to work toward that master builder profile. Can you speak to the process of improving, refueling in midair, if you will? Hey, Joe, I wish we'd had that analogy. I love the idea of refueling in midair. So I'll give you a couple of ideas that might work. First of all, we've got many of them in the book if you decide to buy the book. This is one of those times where having a common vocabulary can be very helpful, both inside an organization and potentially for you interacting with other builders of businesses, because it gives you a frame of reference to begin to compare notes and begin to borrow ideas from your counterparts and frankly from your clones of how they're doing what they're trying to do in building their own businesses. Builders can learn from builders of the same type, and builders can learn from the other type. Chris and I sometimes call these polar complements. You know, if you think about, let's just say for the moment that you're a driver, you're somebody who's so focused and almost fixated on product. Which of these other three types might you be able to learn from the best? Well, we think it might be the captain, because the captain can complement your tenacity, your single-mindedness, your, pardon the pun, drivenness, with a sense of facilitation and empowerment and freeing up the colleagues around you who you no doubt recognize are necessary for your success. So it might be helpful to find a captain nearby, talk to other people, invite them to take the same quiz, and see if you can't start a dialogue with somebody who is your polar complement. Similarly, explorers and crusaders are polar complements. Why? Because explorers, as fascinating as they are, and as systematic as they can be in their analytical approach to things, can sometimes miss the level of emotional inspiration that an explorer brings. And conversely, explorers sometimes miss the focus on the practical dimensions of scaling a business that explorers tend to be pretty good at. Now, those are examples of polar complements, but you're going to learn a lot just from talking with other people like yourselves, because drivers can learn from drivers based on their own personal trajectories, based on the circumstances of their own business. And one other thought for you, Joe. You might ask the people around you to look at this quiz and talk with you honestly and candidly about how they see your builder personality in action. What ideas they have for how you can perhaps get more out of their involvement with your business, how you might leverage the things you are really good at and perhaps delegate out to the things you're not so good at. And through that process, begin to do exactly what you suggest in your question, refuel in midair without crashing. Any quick words of wisdom or advice to young entrepreneurs? Thanks for sharing your insight. Yeah, I love working with new entrepreneurs, both in campus, off campus, and the like. Here's maybe a couple of words that might help you. First of all, it is a marathon that you are considering entering. It's not going to happen quickly in most circumstances. It's going to take tenacity. And entrepreneurship, unlike many other jobs, many other pursuits in life, really is an exercise in personal exposure. Your personality is on display. It's going to be on display to your loved ones. It's going to be on display to your team members. It's going to be on display to your customers, your investors, as you build the business that you have in your mind's eye. Understand yourself. Socrates said it in 2 words: know thyself. Start that process as you build your first business with the kind of wisdom and self-insight that will allow you to make better, more conscious decisions that reinforce what you already are good at and keep you open and humble about the other skill sets that you may need to round out and become a broader, more versatile entrepreneur. We hope our book, Built for Growth, can help you in this journey. We hope it can help you get prepared for that marathon. And above all, help you emulate some of the success of the people who have won those marathons. Thanks a lot.